The Machiavellians, Part 4. George Sorel, A Note on Myth and Violence. George Sorel occupied a unique position in the Machiavellians. For starters, since he was a political extremist, Sorel was not a true Machiavellian. As Burnham explained, quote, Machiavellian principles are not committed to any single political program. Indeed, Sorel threw his support behind some of the most extreme political programs of his time. He wrote numerous articles praising the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet Union. For one of many examples, in an article for a Soviet publication, Sorel hailed Lenin as, quote, the greatest theoretician of socialism since Marx, and a statesman whose genius recalls that of Peter the Great. Sorel initially embraced Marxism in his early writings, but Sorel was not just any extremist. Sorel was the kind of extremist whose extremism oscillated wildly between the extremes. But Sorel didn't stop there. He was also the kind of extremist who managed to publish scholarly contributions to the ideologies on both the radical left and the reactionary right. Shortly after he published Reflections on Violence in 1908, Sorel briefly aligned with Action Française, a monarchist and nationalist movement in France led by Charles Marat. This fusion of nationalism and socialism influenced early fascist thought. Sorel also contributed significantly to syndicalism, a theory of revolutionary labor uprising which proposed to overthrow capitalism by organizing workers into industry-specific labor unions, or syndicates. Syndicalism, especially at the time of Sorel's writings, drew heavily upon the ideas of Karl Marx. Syndicalists like Sorel maintained that organizing laborers into trade unions would place workers into groups in which they shared strong economic interests. Laborers could then secure such interests, Sorel contended, only by violence. Sorel championed violent methods of working class resistance, especially labor strikes. This strategy, Sorel argued, provided the most promising method whereby workers may seize the means of production. But this was not Sorel's primary contribution to revolutionary syndicalism. 60 years before Sorel's Reflections on Violence, Marx's Communist Manifesto in 1848 asserted that the bourgeoisie would not relinquish power voluntarily. Marx therefore advocated violence as a necessary means of overturning class oppression. Like Marx, Sorel advocated violence as a strategy of furthering working class interests. But Sorel took Marx's theory of violence a few steps further by emphasizing the role of myth in motivating and sustaining violence. Paradoxically, by way of his extremism, Sorel's thinking was not far removed from that of the Machiavellians. Sorel recognized the important role of violence in securing collective interests. As described in parts 1 and 2 of the Machiavellians, this was precisely Machiavelli's point when he identified arms as the first condition of liberty, and that liberty is guaranteed only by martial force. Furthermore, Sorel's focus on myth bore strong similarity to Machiavelli's contention that religion plays an indispensable role in civilization. But beyond religion, Sorel applied his analysis of myths to beliefs in general, including scientific theories. In addition to his extremism, Sorel's opposition to science also put him at odds with the Machiavellian tradition. As Burnham wrote, to the extent that he rejects science, Sorel is certainly outside the Machiavellian tradition. But here again, Sorel's departure from the Machiavellians was only partial. As Burnham clarified, Sorel was not wholly opposed to science. Sorel's criticism was not so much of science itself, but of academic pseudoscience, or what he called little science, which primarily served to justify the actions of the powerful. Cloaked in the shroud of science, these theories reinforced ideas of imperialism and racial superiority. Popular examples in Sorel's time included racial theory and climatic theory, which attempted to explain all of human history in terms of race and climate. Like the Machiavellians, who rejected such monisms, Sorel disregarded quote-unquote scientific attempts to reduce historical explanations to exactly one cause. Moreover, Sorel's skepticism of scientific dogmas related closely to the Machiavellian position that Burnham called anti-formalism, or the refusal to take words at face value. Simply labeling a theory scientific does not make it so, just as calling a country democratic does not make the Democratic People's Republic of Korea a democracy. Sorel's dismissal of science partly derived from the fact that his writings did not concern rational scientific truths, but beliefs, whether true or false. Sorel did not totally reject scientific methods. After all, he spent a majority of his life as an engineer and surely reserved a degree of appreciation for science. Rather, Sorel doubted scientific theories. For Sorel, scientific theories represent nothing more than myths. But that does not diminish their power. Quite the contrary, Sorel argued that myths play a greater role, or as he put it, function in society than facts. As an extremist, Sorel's interests lay in how to rouse people into a political revolution. Sorel realized that political revolution requires convincing a massive amount of people to get incredibly violent, or perhaps better said, credibly violent. Looking to history, Sorel found science and rational argument inadequate for this task. Sorel observed that the vast majority of wars and revolutions were motivated not by rational arguments, but by irrational myths. In contrast to economic materialists like Karl Marx and Adam Smith, who emphasized rational self-interest, Sorel stressed humanity's tendency for irrational behavior. Instead of acting based on their self-interest, Sorel observed that people more often tend to behave according to irrational beliefs and myths. Accordingly, Sorel found science and logic inadequate for motivating political revolutions. Thus, he concluded that fomenting mass violence requires a myth that appeals to the hearts and minds of the masses, stirs their basest passions, and harnesses their capacity for irrational violence. Burnham contended that Sorel, despite his anti-scientism, paradoxically arrived at his conclusion, quote, using careful scientific analysis. Indeed, Sorel came to this position using methods akin to science, observation of inputs and outputs. Historically, Sorel observed, outputs of mass violence require inputs of grand myths. Though dismissive of science, Sorel maintained a realistic and quasi-scientific approach to politics and power. Thus, Sorel is not that different from the Machiavellians. And though his anti-scientism and extremism disqualified him from the Machiavellian tradition, Sorel nevertheless contributed significantly to the Italian elitist school. Following the Machiavellian tradition that Burnham outlined in parts 1 and 2, identifying the real meaning of political language requires analyzing its historical context. Therefore, it seems appropriate to provide a brief biography of Sorel to situate his writings in the context of his life and times. Sorel was born in Cherbourg, France, in 1847 to a middle-class Catholic family. His father ran a small business, and his mother was the daughter of a local mayor. The young Sorel excelled in school, graduating from the prestigious École Polytechnique in 1866. Sorel lived through a tumultuous period in French history. Let's face it, which period isn't a tumultuous time in French history? Anyway, Sorel's early years witnessed the rise of Napoleon III, the first president, the second emperor, and the last monarch of France. Sorel also lived through the disruptive period of France's industrialization. One of Napoleon III's first priorities was the industrialization of France, which at the time stood well behind that of the United Kingdom and even some Germanic states. As France industrialized, this created a new class of workers, industrial labor. The emergence of industrial laborers marked an important development in history and one of the primary topics of Sorel's writings. Labor organizing was quite new at Sorel's time, and he contributed significantly to theories of organizing labor movements. Though famous for his writings on labor, violence, and myth, Sorel began his career as an engineer. After retiring from engineering, Sorel managed a prolific second career as a writer. Indeed, Sorel may have been one of the most productive retired people of all time. In the 30 years between his retirement in 1892 and his death in 1922, Sorel published more than a dozen books. Several more were published posthumously. Sorel retained from his engineering background a systematic view of the world. Similarly to how engineers view industrial infrastructure in terms of systems acting upon each other, Sorel regarded society as a system of inputs and outputs. For Sorel, myth and violence constituted social functions that constantly interact with each other, like the cog and wheel in a vast social system. In the building of a dam, for example, engineers designed turbines to harness the power of the flow of water. In this analogy, violence is the water. Myth is the turbine. Myth is required to harness the power of violence. Violence is required to keep the myth going. Using investigative methods of engineering, Sorel's description of myth and violence in terms of their function emphasized their instrumental value in society. This approach closely resembled Burnham's concept of formal and real meaning of political speech. Instead of taking myths at their face value, or formal meaning, Sorel evaluated myths in terms of their instrumental value, or real meaning. Moreover, by portraying myth and violence in terms of their function, Sorel emphasized their mechanistic effect upon society. Again, inputs and outputs. Sorel was not alone in his quest to discover which inputs produce the desired social outputs. Taking lessons learned from industrial engineering, many thinkers in Sorel's time explored theories of social engineering. In many ways, Sorel embodied the stereotypical social engineer of the 19th and early 20th centuries. He took the lessons of engineering and applied them to human society, and many around the same time experimented with applying concepts of engineering to humans. One of the most famous exemplars of social engineering was Frederick Winslow Taylor, also trained as an engineer. Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management, published in 1911, applied principles of engineering to the workforce. Taylor pioneered a system of management designed to maximize worker efficiency. He reduced each job to its rudimentary parts and measured each task down to the hundredth of a minute. Using his engineering training, Taylor scrutinized which inputs yield the desired outputs. Put another way, Taylor used methods of engineering to discover which inputs generate the greatest productivity, measured in output per worker per hour. Social engineering also related to another popular trend during the 19th and 20th centuries, utopianism. Many believed that social engineering had the potential to perfect humanity. Such attitudes appeared in many utopian novels of the period, from Bellamy's Looking Backward in 1888 to Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland in 1915. Sorel did not ascribe to utopian myths, but he nevertheless appreciated their effect upon society. Though not a Machiavellian in the fullest sense, Sorel nevertheless significantly influenced the Italian elitist school, especially Robert Michel's and Vilfredo Pareto. Sorel's systematic, if not scientific, approach to understanding power provided two important concepts for the Machiavellians: the function of myth and the function of violence. Chapter 1. The function of myth. By way of his engineering background, Sorel took an instrumentalist view of society. With regard to beliefs and myths, similarly to his position on science, Sorel did not care so much about the validity of a particular belief. Rather, his primary interest lay in how belief systems, or myths, influenced society and directed human behavior. For Sorel, the truth of a myth was, to a large degree, irrelevant. What concerned Sorel was that myths exert real effects upon society and human behavior. Whether true or false, myths play an indispensable role or function in social systems and directing the course of history. Sorel arrived at an important realization regarding the role that myths play in human civilization. Since science and rational arguments cannot motivate mass political movement, Burnham explained only, quote, an all-embracing myth can arouse the masses to uncompromising revolutionary action. Put briefly, fictions motivate political action, not facts. Thus, just as facts don't care about your feelings, as Ben Shapiro is fond of saying, the converse is also true. Feelings don't care about your facts. When it comes to inspiring mass political movements, appeals to emotion are far more potent than appeals to logic. As Sorel said, myths are not descriptions of things, but expressions of determination to act. Sorel noted that, paradoxically, myths bear some common characteristics to science. Sorel observed that a myth and a scientific hypothesis both constitute what he called a, quote, intellectual product. It is the work of theorists who, after observing and discussing the known facts, seek to establish a model to which they can compare existing society in order to estimate the amount of good and evil it contains. In other words, myths and scientific theories both take observations of the world and try to make some sense out of those findings. But unlike science, myths are not falsifiable. Indeed, this is an advantage that myths have over science in Sorel's estimation. Of course, the absence of falsifiability places myths at a disadvantage with regard to the truth, but gives them a decisive advantage with regard to their perpetuation and propagation in society. Myths cannot be proven wrong, therefore they survive, only by virtue of popular appeal to human irrationality. As Sorel elaborated, quote, a myth cannot be refuted, since it is, at bottom, identical with the convictions of a group, being the expression of these convictions in the language of movement, and it is, in consequence, unanalyzable into parts which could be placed on the plane of historical descriptions. Similarly to Gaetano Mosca's observation regarding what he called social forces, Sorel argued that popular myths cannot be arbitrary because they must appeal to the sentiments and values of the masses. Therefore, Burnham concluded, quote, though the myth is not a scientific theory and is therefore not required to conform to the facts, it is nevertheless not at all arbitrary. Not just any myth will do. In order to generate violence, a myth must appeal to the values and sentiments of the people and excite them into action. Most important for Sorel, it must override man's rational faculties. As Sorel advised, quote, use must be made of a body of images which, by intuition alone, and before any considered analyses are made, is capable of evoking as an undivided whole the mass of sentiments. But Sorel's idea of the function of myth went beyond the realm of political revolution. Sorel saw myth as a prerequisite to all human behavior. Quote, without leaving the present, without reasoning about the future, which seems forever condemned to escape our reason, we should be unable to act at all. Sorel pointed out a critical aspect of the human psyche. Our actions require goals to be striven toward. Without goals, we are unlikely to accomplish anything at all. Therefore, we create a fictional, mythical image of where we want to be in the future. Goals are nothing more than myths. They are not real in any material sense, yet they are useful and indeed necessary. This applies equally to the individual level as it does to the societal level. In his conception of the function of myth, Sorel identified yet another crucial aspect of human behavior. Motivating people to violence requires appealing to their emotions. Often, the most powerful appeals to emotion are popular myths. Rarely do politicians ask their people to go to war over resources, though that may be the ultimate aim. Instead, leaders implore their citizens to take up arms in the name of religion, patriotism, or some other myth, like democracy. Woodrow Wilson sold World War I as a war to make the world safe for democracy. Kennedy sold Vietnam as a test of American resolve against communism. And George W. Bush sold the war in Iraq and Afghanistan as a global war on terror. Sorel recognized a reciprocal relationship between myth and violence. Similarly to what engineers called a positive feedback loop, myths have the potential of stimulating violence. But as detailed in the next chapter, the relationship may be inverted. Myths also have the potential of restraining violence, resembling what engineers call a negative feedback loop. Chapter 2, the function of violence. Just as Sorel argued that myth plays an indispensable role in the perpetuation of violence, he also argued the converse, that violence plays a necessary role in the survival of myth. As Sorel stated, quote, a great myth makes a social movement serious, formidable, and heroic. But this it would not do unless the myth inspired and was in turn sustained by violence. As Burnham clarified, quote, Sorel is careful to explain that by violence he does not mean brutality, end quote. Sorel simply pointed out the function of violence in society. Again, using terms borrowed from engineering, by function of violence, Sorel identified the fundamental role of force in social regulation and change. Sorel's observation closely aligns with the Machiavellian tradition, which rejects idealistic interpretations of political power in favor of a more realistic assessment of how authority is maintained. Even in ostensibly peaceful societies, laws are only enforced through a credible threat of violence. Without this underlying threat, legal systems would lack the means to ensure compliance. As Burnham said, quote, force is always a main factor in regulating society, end quote. Burnham pointed out that at the time of Sorel's writings in the late 19th and 20th centuries, quote, humanitarianism and pacifist ideas were almost universally professed by the leaders of official opinion, end quote. Sorel attributed the rise of pacifist and humanitarian ideas to industrial capitalism. For Sorel, humanitarianism and pacifism were simply myths that served the capitalist interests and the status quo. As Burnham put it, quote, the humanitarian chatter serves to obscure the social realities. Still more important, the moral denunciation of violence helps to keep the workers quiet and to prevent them from using their own violent methods in strikes and for the revolution. In Burnham's terms of formal and real meaning, the formal meaning of humanitarianism and pacifism are their stated ideas of respect for mankind and nonviolence. Their real meaning is to quell labor uprisings from damaging the capitalist status quo. In addition to their power to stimulate violence, Sorel observed that myths also have the potential of restraining violence, but restricting violence is not always a good thing. Following the Machiavellian tradition, Sorel did not take the ideas of pacifism and humanitarianism at face value. He believed humanitarianism and pacifist rhetoric obscured the real mechanisms of power in society, elaborating upon Machiavelli's observation that power is only won by force or fraud. Sorel observed that a decrease in the former corresponded to an increase in the latter. Sorel's observation suggests that when societies officially reject violence as a means of social change, they inadvertently create conditions where deception flourishes as the most expedient path to power. Thus, from Sorel's perspective, in capitalist countries where violence is officially discouraged and effectively prevents labor uprisings, fraud becomes the predominant method of advancement. As Sorel elaborated, quote, Gradually, the new industrial system has created a new and extraordinary indulgence for all crimes of fraud in the great capitalist countries. End quote. To correct this state of affairs, Burnham advised a general acceptance and acknowledgement of the necessity and function of violence. However, Burnham cautioned that such an open attitude with regard to violence requires a great myth to keep the violence in check. As he put it, quote, an open recognition of the necessity of violence can reverse the social degeneration. Violence, however, can be kept free from brutality and from mere vengeful force only if it is linked to a great myth. Myth and violence, reciprocally acting upon each other, produce not senseless cruelty and suffering, but sacrifice and heroism. To check violence, myths must contain aspects that tame and direct it. Simultaneously, a theory of violence is required to check myths that might otherwise become destructive and oppressive. This balance resembles what Machiavelli called mixed government, or the distribution of power among different social elements. And though not a true Machiavellian himself, Sorel's engineering background and systematic worldview gave him a perspective in which he viewed power in terms of social systems acting upon each other, which is not far from the Machiavellian school of thought. Burnham ended part 4 of his book with an attack on humanitarianism and pacifism, pointing out that neither achieved their professed goals. Quote, the humanitarian ideals of much of the French aristocracy in the 18th century did not in the least mitigate the enormous bloodshed of the Revolution, and may indeed have greatly contributed to its excesses. Pacifist anti-war movements are a prominent feature of modern life. They have not at all served to stop the most gigantic wars of history. Perhaps most striking, Burnham suggested that idealistic humanitarian myths, when divorced from a realistic understanding of violence and power, can actually intensify conflict and suffering rather than alleviate it. Quote, during the Terror, the men who spilt most blood were precisely those who had the greatest desire to let their equals enjoy the golden age they had dreamt of, and who had the most sympathy with human wretchedness. Optimists, idealists, and sensitive men. The greater desire they had for universal happiness, the more inexorable they showed themselves. That is one damning quote. Sorel's analysis, as interpreted by Burnham, offered profound insights into the relationship between myths, violence, and social movements. Rather than accepting humanitarian and pacifist rhetoric at face value, Sorel's perspective examines the actual functions these ideologies serve in maintaining existing power structures. The Machiavellian tradition maintains that understanding political and social reality requires looking beyond stated intentions and observing actual effects. Again, inputs and outputs. The interplay between myths and violence creates a dynamic tension that shapes social movements and political systems. When properly balanced, this tension can produce heroic sacrifice rather than senseless cruelty. However, when myths deny the reality of power and force, they may inadvertently encourage fraud and deception. In an age when humanitarian and pacifist ideals continue to be widely professed, Sorel's insights remain relevant for understanding the complex relationship between our stated values and the reality of how power operates in society. His writings suggest that perhaps the first step toward more humane social relations is not to deny the role of violence, but to acknowledge it explicitly and to develop myths that can channel it toward constructive rather than destructive ends. This concludes my summary of Part 4 of the Machiavellians by James Burnham. Please stay tuned for the next installment covering Robert Michel's work on the limits of democracy and the iron law of oligarchy. And for direct citations for each of these quotes, please see my Substack at benyaturi.substack.com.